Welcome, true Wild West fans. Ever imagine your perfect partner, only to meet someone completely different, yet utterly perfect? Today, we're diving into a captivating story about a rancher, his mail-order bride, and a frontier lesson in love that proves strength comes in all forms. Get ready for a tale where expectations are shattered, and true partnership is forged in the wild heart of the West. He had spent countless lonely nights picturing her. In his mind, she was small and delicately built, with gentle, graceful hands that would tenderly care for his fledgling garden. He imagined her soft, soothing words, finally filling the vast, oppressive silence of his isolated ranch house. But then, as the dust, stirred by the creaking wagon wheels, slowly began to settle, Farmer Silas found himself staring, utterly dumbfounded, up at a woman who could, without a doubt, probably lift him clean off the ground with a single, powerful arm. Agnes Miller stood an imposing 6 feet tall in her worn, sturdy boots, with shoulders that were noticeably broader than most of the men in their small town. Her hands, calloused and strong, looked as though they could handle a heavy plow with far more ease and expertise than they ever could a delicate teacup. The carefully folded letter in his vest pocket suddenly felt like a cruel, elaborate joke, a trick of fate. And the simple wedding ring he had painstakingly carved from a piece of weathered oak seemed, in his suddenly overwhelmed mind, impossibly, laughably small. Just 3 months prior, Silas had nervously placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper, his hands trembling slightly with a mixture of hope and desperation. The ad, plain and to the point, read, "Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings." He had received only one single response, a letter penned in a remarkably neat, careful script that subtly hinted at a loneliness that mirrored his own. Agnes's letters had painted vivid, comforting pictures, cozy, shared meals by a warm hearth, long, quiet conversations under star-filled skies, and the profound understanding of someone who knew intimately the heavy weight of solitude that pressed down relentlessly on isolated homesteads. Yet, in all those heartfelt exchanges, she had never once, not even obliquely, mentioned that she stood taller and was built more powerfully than his own barn door. Reverend Gable, the kindly merchant who had thoughtfully arranged their meeting, cleared his throat nervously as he slowly climbed down from the wagon driver's seat. His eyes darted back and forth, a picture of visible discomfort between Silas's utterly stunned expression and Agnes's undeniably imposing figure. The woman herself seemed equally taken aback, her initial confident posture faltering slightly as she took in Silas's noticeably slighter frame and the way he had to strain his neck upwards just to meet her steady gaze. For a long, agonizing moment, the three of them stood frozen in the dusty ranch yard, stiff and motionless, like actors who had suddenly forgotten their lines on an empty stage. The silence stretched, becoming impossibly long until it felt utterly unbearable. Silas acutely felt the curious, almost intrusive stares of his few scattered neighbors who had gathered, drawn by the rare spectacle, to witness the arrival of his mail-order bride. Mrs. O'Malley from the general store leaned in and whispered something conspiratorially to her husband, discreetly covering her mouth with her hand. Young Timmy Jenkins, bolder than the rest, actually pointed an accusatory finger before his mother. With a sharp yank, pulled his arm quickly down. The entire scene felt like a public spectacle that had gone terribly, embarrassingly wrong, and Silas's cheeks burned crimson with a flush of humiliation that had absolutely nothing to do with the intense afternoon sun. Agnes was finally the one to break the stifling silence, her voice deeper than he had anticipated, but undeniably kind, carrying a calm authority. "You must be Silas," she stated more than questioned. She extended a large, capable hand that completely engulfed his own when he, reluctantly, offered it. Her grip was firm and steady, yet surprisingly careful, as if she was intimately aware of her own considerable strength and his comparative frailty. "I suppose we should talk," she said, her tone suggesting that she harbored the exact same swirling doubts and anxieties that were currently racing through his own bewildered mind. Reverend Gable, sensing the thick, palpable tension, quickly busied himself with the task of unloading Agnes's single, surprisingly large trunk from the wagon bed. It was noticeably larger and heavier than Silas had anticipated, a detail that only reinforced the growing, uncomfortable realization that absolutely nothing about this entire arrangement was going to match his carefully constructed expectations. The merchant's hurried, almost frantic movements betrayed his own profound discomfort with the intensely awkward situation he had unwittingly helped to create. But as Silas watched Agnes survey his modest ranch, not with disappointment or disdain, but with what appeared to be genuine, unfeigned interest, something entirely unexpected began to stir within him. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the simple, unadorned cabin, or at the visible patches in the weathered corral fence. Instead, she nodded slowly, almost approvingly, at his neatly tended vegetable garden and the orderly stack of firewood meticulously piled by the porch. Whatever initial shock or disappointment she might have felt at his own, less than imposing appearance, she was keeping it entirely to herself, maintaining a quiet grace and composure that he hadn't expected from someone who looked like she could, quite literally, break him in half with minimal effort. The very next morning, the day after Agnes's arrival, brought with it a crisis that neither of them had remotely anticipated. Silas's prize bull, named Goliath, a massive, ill-tempered beast, had somehow managed to break through the reinforced fence during the night. Now he stood defiantly, an enormous destructive force, in the very middle of Mrs. O'Malley's prized, meticulously cultivated flower garden, a full 3 properties over. The colossal animal was systematically and thoroughly destroying months of careful, arduous cultivation, and the piercing sound of Mrs. O'Malley's furious, high-pitched shouting could be heard, loud and clear, echoing across the entire valley. Silas stood frozen at his porch railing, nervously wringing his hands as he watched the unfolding disaster with a sick feeling in his stomach. Goliath weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and possessed the temperament of a gathering storm cloud, even on the very best of days. The bull had already charged 2 of the neighboring men who had foolishly attempted to approach him, sending them scrambling ignominiously over fences in undignified, panicked retreat. The situation was quickly escalating into the kind of neighborhood scandal that would undoubtedly follow Silas, a mark of shame for years to come. "You can't rope him from here," Agnes observed calmly from beside him. She had appeared at his elbow without him even noticing, moving with a surprising, almost unnerving quietness for someone of her considerable size. Her eyes were fixed intently on the rampaging bull, an expression on her face that Silas couldn't quite decipher. "And those men down there are going to get themselves trampled if they keep approaching from the front like that." Silas nodded miserably, his shoulders slumped in despair. "Goliath's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what got into him." The truth was, he had been dreading this exact terrifying scenario since the very day he bought the bull. He possessed neither the physical strength nor the necessary experience to handle such a massive, uncooperative animal when it truly decided to misbehave. Most of his neighbors were acutely aware of his limitations, which only made the current, embarrassing situation all the more humiliating for him. Without a single word of warning, Agnes calmly stepped off the porch and began walking directly toward the chaotic scene with long, purposeful strides. Silas scrambled after her, his shorter legs working double time, a desperate blur just to keep up. "Agnes, wait!" He's dangerous when he's agitated like this. You shouldn't." But she was already halfway across the field, her entire attention focused solely on the rampaging bull. As they approached Mrs. O'Malley's property, Silas could see the full, devastating extent of the damage. Rose bushes that had taken 3 years to carefully establish were now completely trampled into the dirt, their delicate petals crushed. The meticulously arranged border stones had been scattered like carelessly tossed toys. Mrs. O'Malley herself stood on her front steps, her face a fiery red with righteous fury, directing a relentless stream of accusations at anyone within earshot. When she spotted Silas approaching, her voice rose another ear-splitting octave. "That monster of yours has destroyed everything," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the devastation. "Look at my garden, Silas. Just look at it. You're going to pay for every single plant, Farmer Silas, and if you can't control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." The other neighbors, drawn by the commotion, nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic disapproval to openly hostile judgment. Agnes, however, ignored the commotion entirely. She studied Goliath's erratic movements with the kind of intense, focused attention usually reserved for deciphering a difficult text. The bull was pawing the ground near what remained of a particularly cherished rosebush, his massive head lowered in a way that clearly suggested he was preparing for yet another charge. 2 more men had arrived, clutching ropes, but they stood at a safe, wary distance, clearly reluctant to get within range of those wicked-looking, formidable horns. Then Agnes did something that made Silas's heart stop cold in his chest. She calmly climbed over the fence and began walking directly, purposefully, toward the agitated animal, her hands completely empty, her movements slow, deliberate, but brimming with an undeniable confidence. The entire crowd fell into an astonished silence, watching in a mixture of fascination and horror as this impossibly tall, incredibly brave woman approached the beast that had sent grown men scrambling for cover. Even Mrs. O'Malley for once stopped her tirade, her mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. Goliath's massive head swung slowly toward Agnes as she approached, his nostrils flaring dramatically with each heavy, snorting breath. The bull's eyes rolled wide at the edges, a sure and terrifying sign of an animal pushed far beyond the brink of reason. Silas felt his throat constrict, a knot of fear, as he watched his mail-order bride walk calmly into what looked like certain, gruesome death. Every instinct screamed at him to call out, to stop her, to pull her back from the precipice, but something in her deliberate, unhurried movements held him frozen, utterly paralyzed in place. Agnes began speaking to the bull in a low, steady voice, a soothing murmur that carried just far enough for Silas to catch fragments of her words. She wasn't using the sharp, commanding, often harsh tone most people employed when dealing with agitated livestock. Instead, her words flowed like water over smooth stones, rhythmic and incredibly soothing. Goliath's huge ears twitched forward, slowly, cautiously, and his frantic pawing gradually, almost imperceptibly, slowed to a halt. The crowd of mesmerized onlookers held their collective breath, a palpable tension in the air, as woman and beast regarded each other across 10 feet of trampled garden. "Easy there, big fellow," Agnes murmured, extending one hand, palm up, in Goliath's direction, a gesture of peace. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." She took another step closer, and Silas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The bull could charge at any moment, and there was absolutely nowhere for her to run in Mrs. O'Malley's enclosed garden space. But Goliath didn't charge. Instead, something utterly extraordinary happened. The massive animal's breathing began to even out, slowly, deeply, and his aggressive, tense posture relaxed incrementally, almost magically. Agnes continued her approach, never once breaking eye contact, never once hurrying her movements. When she was finally close enough to touch him, She reached out a confident hand and gently placed it on his enormous neck, just behind his left ear. The effect was immediate and truly startling. Goliath's massive head dropped even lower, and a sound that was almost like a sigh, a deep exhalation of relief, escaped from his chest. Agnes began scratching gently behind his ear with practiced, soothing fingers, and the bull actually leaned into her touch, much like an oversized, affectionate dog seeking comfort. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that several people in the crowd audibly gasped, their disbelief palpable. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Agnes called over her shoulder, her voice carrying the quiet, unwavering authority of someone accustomed to being instantly obeyed, without taking her eyes off Goliath. Reverend Gable scrambled to comply, returning quickly with a length of sturdy rope from Silas's barn. Agnes expertly fashioned a simple halter, with movements so smooth and practiced they seemed rehearsed, a part of her very being. Within minutes, she was calmly leading Goliath out of the ruined garden, as docile and obedient as a lamb. The bull followed her without any resistance, his earlier aggression completely forgotten, vanquished by her calm presence. The assembled neighbors parted like water before them, their faces a mixture of utter amazement, bewilderment, and grudging respect. Mrs. O'Malley stood utterly speechless on her porch steps, her carefully prepared speech about uncontrolled livestock dying, unspoken, on her lips. As they passed Silas, Agnes caught his eye and offered a small, genuine smile that completely transformed her entire face. For the first time since her arrival, he saw past her intimidating size, past the initial shock, to something much warmer, much deeper, underneath. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said casually, as if taming rampaging bulls was simply something she did every morning before breakfast. "We should probably fix that before he decides to take another walk. Don't miss out on more incredible stories of courage and resilience. Subscribe to True Wild West and click the notification bell for daily adventures." Word of Agnes's extraordinary feat with the bull spread through the settlement faster than wildfire through dry grass. By afternoon, a steady stream of curious neighbors had found various excuses to visit Silas's ranch, their thinly veiled curiosity barely concealed behind offers of welcome meals and unsolicited gardening advice. Each visitor cast furtive, lingering glances at Agnes as she worked diligently alongside Silas to repair the damaged fence. Their hushed, whispered conversations created a constant, murmuring undercurrent of speculation that made Silas increasingly uncomfortable and self-conscious. The attention reached a peak when Jacob Morrison arrived with his 3 strapping sons in tow, ostensibly to help with the fence work, but clearly far more interested in getting a closer, first-hand look at the remarkable woman who had so calmly tamed Goliath with her bare hands. Morrison was the kind of man who measured everything and everyone by physical strength, and in most departments, he found Silas glaringly lacking. His very presence always made Silas feel smaller, more insignificant than he already was. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock, Farmer Silas," Morrison commented, leaning casually against a fence post with a studied air of nonchalance. His boys arranged themselves behind him like an eager audience, their eyes fixed intently on Agnes as she drove heavy fence posts into the hard, unyielding ground with powerful, rhythmic swings of a massive sledgehammer. Each blow sent the post deeper with more force than Silas could have managed with twice as many swings, using all his might. Silas felt a familiar heat creep up his neck as Morrison's unspoken implications became painfully clear. The man was subtly questioning whether Silas could truly provide for and protect a woman of Agnes's obvious, formidable capabilities. It was the exact same gnawing doubt that had been steadily eating away at Silas's own confidence since her arrival. but hearing it voiced, even indirectly, by someone else made it sting twice as sharply, twice as deeply. "Agnes grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana," Silas replied, trying desperately to keep his voice steady, to maintain a facade of composure. "She knows her way around animals." It was true, as far as it went. Though he had learned this crucial fact only that very morning, when she had casually mentioned it while calmly examining Goliath's temperament. Her letters had spoken of a desire for a quiet life, but they had never once detailed the myriad experiences that had so profoundly shaped her into someone capable of handling a 2,000-pound bull without breaking a single bead of sweat. Morrison's eldest son, a strapping, confident young man of 19, stepped forward with the kind of unshakable self-assurance that came from never having been physically challenged or truly tested by life. "Maybe she'd like some help with that post-hole digger," he offered, his voice carrying the inherent assumption that his assistance would be both enthusiastically welcomed and absolutely necessary. "Looks like heavy work for—" He trailed off, catching himself, apparently realizing that commenting on Agnes's gender might not be particularly wise, given the astonishing display they had all witnessed that morning. Agnes looked up from her strenuous work, sweat glistening lightly on her forehead, despite the relatively cool temperature. Her expression was polite, but distant, as she carefully considered the young man's offer. "I appreciate the thought," she said, her voice even and calm. "But I've got my rhythm now. Might be better if you helped Silas with stretching the wire." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, yet there was something in it, an underlying firmness, that subtly but effectively discouraged any further offers of assistance. The quiet, polite rejection clearly stung the boy's pride in a way that was immediately visible to everyone. His shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched, his youthful face flushing with embarrassment as he realized that this unusual, self-sufficient woman had absolutely no need for his strength or his presumed protection. Morrison's other sons exchanged quick, telling glances that spoke volumes about their collective confusion regarding the proper, expected social dynamics of the situation. Silas watched the entire interaction with a growing sense of unease and internal conflict. He could almost see the wheels turning in Morrison's head, the silent calculations being made about power, about perception, and about community standing. Men like Morrison lived by clear, rigid rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Agnes's very presence profoundly disrupted those established rules in ways that made some people, particularly men like Morrison, deeply uncomfortable and uncertain. But what troubled Silas most deeply was his own complicated reaction. A significant part of him felt an immense, burgeoning pride in Agnes's obvious competence and fierce independence. Yet another, more insecure part of him wondered if her immense strength merely highlighted his own perceived inadequacies in ways that would, eventually, become utterly impossible to ignore or reconcile. That evening, as the last of the curious neighbors finally departed, their lingering shadows stretching with the setting sun, Silas found himself alone with Agnes for the first time since her arrival. The silence between them felt heavier, thicker, than the humid, oppressive air that often preceded a violent thunderstorm. They sat on opposite ends of his small, worn porch, the space between them measured not just in feet, but in the crushing weight of unspoken doubts and wildly mismatched expectations. Agnes was the one to break the profound silence first, her voice carrying a weariness, a subtle vulnerability that hadn't been present when she had so fearlessly faced down the rampaging bull. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but rather staring out at the darkening horizon where the first hesitant stars were just beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast canvas of night. Her profile was strong and angular, nothing at all like the delicate, soft features he had so vividly imagined during those long, solitary months of correspondence. Silas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the aged wood creaking faintly under his slight weight, a small sound in the overwhelming quiet. "I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure what exactly he could have written. That he was smaller than most men. That he sometimes felt hopelessly lost and overwhelmed on his own ranch. That he had placed the advertisement not out of confidence or strength, but out of a desperate, gnawing loneliness that consumed him. About what? Agnes turned slowly to face him, and her directness caught him completely off guard, making his heart lurch. About being shorter than average. About having neighbors who measure a man's worth by how much weight he can lift. There was no hint of mockery or judgment in her voice, but there was a sharp, almost uncanny understanding that made Silas wonder what profound experiences had taught her to recognize such deeply ingrained societal judgments so quickly, so acutely. The raw honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response from him. "About feeling like I'm not enough," he said quietly, the admission a painful wrench in his gut. "Not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life I'm trying so desperately to build here." The raw, vulnerable admission hung in the evening air between them like acrid smoke from a dying fire, impossible to retract, impossible to take back. Agnes remained quiet for a long, contemplative moment, her strong fingers drumming a slow, steady rhythm against the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice held a surprising, almost tender gentleness that profoundly surprised him. "You know what I saw today when you watched me with Goliath?" She didn't wait for his answer, simply continued, her gaze unwavering. "I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own embarrassment, Silas. Most men would have tried to stop me, would have insisted on handling it themselves, even if they got hurt, even if they got trampled in the process." Silas felt something loosen in his chest, a tight knot, slowly unraveling, though he wasn't sure if it was simply immense relief or something far more complicated, far more meaningful. "And what I should have written," Agnes continued, her voice soft but firm, "was that I'm tired of being seen as a curiosity or a challenge. That I've spent my whole life having people assume I must be looking for someone to constantly prove their strength against mine." The revelation of her own struggles, her own burdens, shifted something fundamental and profound in how Silas suddenly saw their entire situation. All day long he had been relentlessly focused on what he lacked, on how he didn't measure up to some imagined, impossibly high standard. But Agnes's words suggested that she, too, had her own heavy burdens to carry, her own deeply personal reasons for seeking a life far away from the constant, often harsh, judgments of others. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Genuine curiosity, replacing the gnawing anxiety that had plagued him relentlessly since her unexpected arrival. Agnes reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked distinctly worn from repeated handling, from being read and reread countless times. "Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter?" she asked, carefully unfolding it in the dim, fading porch light. "You said that you believed real partnership meant two people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel smaller." Silas did indeed remember writing those very words, though they had seemed almost foolishly idealistic, perhaps even naive, when he had penned them by lamplight months ago. He had even worried that such a sentiment might unintentionally drive away potential respondents who expected more traditional, clearly defined marital arrangements. Now, hearing them quoted back to him, they sounded like a profound promise, a sacred vow, that he wasn't entirely sure he knew how to truly keep, how to truly embody in practice. "I meant it when I wrote it," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But I'm not sure I understood what it would actually look like in practice." He gestured vaguely toward the fence they had repaired together, where her competence and effortless strength had been so strikingly evident beside his own struggles and limitations. "Today made me realize how much I don't know about my own land, my own animals." Agnes refolded the letter with care and tucked it away back into her pocket, but not before Silas caught a fleeting glimpse of other papers nestled inside. More of his letters, he realized with a sudden jolt, kept and apparently reread enough times to show the wear and tear of affection. The thought that his words had been important enough to her to preserve, to cherish, gave him an unexpected surge of something warm and unfamiliar that might have been, could have been, hope. "You know what I noticed today?" Agnes asked, shifting in her chair to face him more directly, her gaze piercing. "When Goliath got loose, you didn't run to get help from Morrison or any of the other men. You came to find me. That tells me something important about who you are, Silas. When the pretenses, when the social expectations fall away." Silas hadn't thought about his actions in those terms, hadn't analyzed his immediate instinctive response, but she was profoundly right. When crisis had struck, his unthinking instinct had been to turn to her, not because he consciously expected her to magically solve all his problems, but because somehow, deep down, he had instinctively sensed that she would understand what truly needed to be done. It was a level of unspoken trust that surprised him, given how recently they had truly met. "In my last letter," Agnes continued, her voice gaining a quiet intensity, "I wrote that I was tired of being alone. But I didn't just mean physically alone. I meant being alone with my own thoughts, my own struggles, my own deepest dreams for what life could truly be like if I found the right person to share it with." She paused, studying his face intently in the gathering darkness, her eyes searching his. "I think maybe we both advertised for someone to rescue us from loneliness, Silas. But what we might actually need, what we truly desire, is someone to be lonely with sometimes, and strong with other times." The distinction she was drawing felt immensely important, profoundly significant, though Silas wasn't entirely sure he grasped all its complex implications just yet. Traditional marriage arrangements in their community seemed to follow predictable, well-worn patterns. The man provided unwavering protection and essential resources. The woman provided invaluable domestic skills and unwavering companionship. What Agnes was subtly suggesting, what she was bravely articulating, sounded far more complex, far more nuanced, and infinitely more honest than those familiar, rigid roles. "So we try," he said finally, the words a soft admission, a quiet commitment. "We try to figure out what partnership truly looks like when it doesn't fit the usual expected patterns." It wasn't a question, but Agnes nodded anyway, her expression serious, but not without a gentle, encouraging warmth. "But first," she said, standing and brushing a little dust from her skirt, her gaze meeting his, "you're going to show me how you plan to propose. Because technically, Silas, we're still just two strangers who happen to be sharing a porch." Her tone was light, playful almost, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the formality, the genuine intention behind the act, mattered to her far more than she was letting on. Silas felt his pulse quicken, a sudden surge of adrenaline, as he realized she was absolutely right. In all the confusion, the awkwardness, and the sheer overwhelming nature of her arrival, they had never actually addressed the fundamental, pivotal question of whether they truly wanted to proceed with marriage. Silas's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his vest pocket and carefully withdrew the small, carved wooden box he had been carrying, a constant weight of hope and anxiety since dawn. Inside lay the simple, unadorned ring he had meticulously carved from a piece of oak that had fallen during last winter's fierce storms, its surface polished smooth and warm by countless hours of careful, hopeful work. It was simple and unadorned, nothing at all like the gleaming gold bands that wealthier men could so easily afford, but he had poured months of his solitary hopes and dreams into its painstaking creation. "I had planned to do this properly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "To wait until after we had talked, until I was sure you weren't disappointed by—" He gestured vaguely at himself, at the modest ranch, at everything that wasn't, couldn't be, what she might have expected, what she might have dreamed of. Agnes stepped closer, close enough that he could clearly smell the honest, earthy scent of hard work on her clothes and see the genuine, gentle curiosity in her eyes as she looked at the ring, then at him. "May I?" she asked softly, extending her hand slightly toward the small, wooden box. When he nodded, a silent, almost imperceptible gesture, she carefully lifted the ring, turning it slowly in the dim moonlight to examine the intricate grain of the wood and the surprisingly smooth finish he had managed to achieve. "You made this yourself," she said, and it wasn't a question, but a quiet, profound statement of fact. Her voice held a note of something that might have been wonder, a soft awe. "How long did it take?" As she spoke, she gently slipped the simple wooden ring onto her finger, testing the fit, her gaze unwavering. It was, just as Silas had feared it would be, too small, stopping stubbornly at her second knuckle instead of sliding comfortably home. 3 months, Silas admitted, his heart sinking, a heavy stone, as he watched the ring refuse to fit properly, a metaphor for his own perceived failures. "I started it the day after I received your first letter. The heartbreaking failure of something so basic, so simple, felt like a cruel metaphor for everything that had seemed to go wrong since her arrival." He had imagined her hands as delicate, had carved the ring to match his fantasy rather than the vibrant reality standing before him. But instead of disappointment, Agnes's face showed something entirely unexpected, something that brought a fragile hope to his heart. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her strong features completely, illuminating them with a soft inner light. 3 months, she repeated softly, the words filled with a quiet understanding. "You spent 3 months making something so personal, for a woman you had never even met, based on nothing but letters and hope." She looked down at the ring, still perched, imperfectly, on her knuckle. "Do you know what that tells me about who you are, Silas?" Emmett shook his head slowly, not trusting his voice, which felt thick with unshed emotion. The evening had already contained more raw, emotional honesty than he typically experienced in an entire month, and he felt utterly wrung out, exhausted by the sheer intensity of it all. "It tells me you're someone who believes in taking great care with important things, Silas," Agnes said, her voice firm but kind. "Someone who puts profound thought and genuine effort into making something truly beautiful, even when no one is watching to judge your work." She carefully slipped the ring off her finger and held it up between them, the simple wooden band a symbol of their unexpected connection. And someone practical enough to know that rings can be resized, but true character cannot. The simple, profound statement hit Silas with an unexpected, almost overwhelming force. All day he had been relentlessly focused on physical inadequacies, on measurements and comparisons that seemed to matter so much to everyone, to society, around them. But Agnes was suggesting with quiet conviction that there were other ways to measure true worth, other kinds of strength that might matter far more in the long run, in the grand tapestry of a shared life. "So is that a yes?" he asked, the question coming out more uncertain, more hesitant than he had intended. Agnes's answer came not in words, but in a profound, unwavering action. She gently took Silas's hands in her own, larger, strong ones, and carefully placed the wooden ring in his palm, then guided his hands to close softly around it, a tangible connection between them. "Ask me properly, Silas," she said, her voice gentle but firm, carrying a quiet command. "Not because you think you should, or because we made an arrangement through letters, but because you truly want to." Silas looked up into her face, really seeing her, truly seeing the woman before him, for the very first time since she had stepped off Reverend Gable's wagon so long ago, it seemed. Yes, she was taller and undeniably stronger than he had ever expected. But there was also a profound kindness in her eyes that hadn't quite come through in their written correspondence, however heartfelt. There was unmistakable intelligence there, and a subtle, knowing humor, and something that looked suspiciously like deep affection, despite their brief, unconventional acquaintance. "Agnes Miller," he said, his voice growing steadier, more resolute with each passing word. "Will you marry me? Not because of letters or arrangements or what other people expect, but because I truly believe we might be able to build something good together, something neither of us could ever build alone." "Yes," she said simply, the single word hanging in the evening air between them like a sacred promise, a powerful, unspoken vow. "But I have conditions." The unexpected addition made Silas's stomach tighten momentarily, with a fresh wave of anxiety, but her expression remained warm, reassuring. "I want us to resize this ring together," she began, her gaze unwavering. "I want to learn how to work with wood, and I want you to teach me, and I want you to let me teach you about cattle and horses, and all the things I know that might be truly useful here." The relief that flooded through Silas was so intense, so profound, it almost made him lightheaded, dizzy with happiness. Her conditions weren't demands for him to change who he was, to become someone he wasn't, but rather generous invitations to share knowledge, to share skills, to share life itself. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of it. Every single part of it. Your support keeps the frontier stories alive. Consider a super chat to help True Wild West bring more amazing tales to life." 6 months later, as autumn painted the valley in breathtaking shades of gold and crimson, Silas and Agnes stood before their neighbors in the small, quaint community church. The wooden ring, now properly sized and comfortably fitted, and accompanied by a matching band that Agnes had carved for Silas, sat snugly and beautifully on her finger. Their partnership, though as unconventional as their very first meeting, had proven to be remarkably effective, a testament to their unique bond. The ranch prospered, thriving under their combined complementary efforts. Silas's meticulous attention to detail, his careful planning, paired perfectly with Agnes's formidable physical strength and her deep intuitive expertise with animals. Together, they had transformed the modest homestead into one of the most productive and respected in the entire area. Goliath, now properly contained by reinforced fencing that Agnes had helped design and build, had sired several calves that promised to be as impressive and robust as their powerful father, but considerably more manageable and even-tempered. More importantly, Silas had discovered slowly but surely that true strength came in many diverse forms, not just brute force. While he might never physically match Agnes's astonishing ability to wrestle a stubborn bull, or to split heavy fence posts with a single powerful swing, His own innate patience, his thoughtful, methodical approach, had, in turn, taught her the invaluable wisdom of planning ahead, of carefully thinking through problems before merely attacking them with brute force. The initial whispers and the subtle, speculative gossip of their neighbors had gradually, imperceptibly, given way to genuine respect. And even, Silas noticed with a touch of quiet pride, a touch of envy. Other couples in the community had begun to truly notice how Silas and Agnes worked together, seamlessly, as a unified team. They observed how the couple consulted each other on every important decision, how they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company, even during the mundane, repetitive tasks of daily life on the ranch. As they spoke their sacred vows on that crisp, clear October morning, Silas caught sight of Jacob Morrison in the congregation. The man who had once openly questioned Silas's ability to provide for, to protect, such a formidable woman, now nodded slowly, almost approvingly, his face etched with a newfound respect, as the couple promised to honor and support each other through whatever challenges, whatever joys, lay ahead in their shared life. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together so unexpectedly was now all but forgotten, a distant memory. It had been replaced by something far more valuable, far more enduring, a true partnership built on mutual respect, on shared responsibility, and on the kind of deep, abiding love that grew organically from truly seeing, truly accepting, and truly cherishing another person exactly as they were, flaws and all. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where unexpected encounters change everything in the wild frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider supporting True Wild West with a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us, truly.